Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Mitski record, The Land is Inhospitable, and So Are We. Look, for a pretty pastoral singer-songwriter record, this album title and cover have some pretty screamo, maybe entry-level depressive black metal elements that I'm here for. I think it's great. Well, I do feel like very few people would really claim 2022's Laurel Hell as a specifically weak album, even in the context of the Mitski catalog. I mean, I personally enjoyed it. I also do feel like it didn't really get the immediate adoration that some of her other records did, like Be the Cowboy and Puberty 2. And hey, it only makes sense. Mitski today in 2023 is a wildly different artist than Mitski in 2015, let's say. And ultimately, as time has gone on, her fanbase has grown and altered as she has. Really, though, Laurel Hell did seem a bit underwhelming for Mitski at the time. I mean, sure, it was very popular and incredibly relevant within the mainstream, but it did seem like the only people that really adored it, just fawned over it, and talked about it for weeks on end were the hardcore Mitski fans. And I'm just not just talking about the person that really likes a song like, say, Your Best American Girl. I'm talking about the sends people bombs in the mail because they don't like Mitski, has gang wars with BTS stans, that kind of Mitski fan. The ones that do whatever people on Stan Twitter do. And hey, after spending multiple releases continuing to build up this progressive, artsy, semi-electronic pop sound, it only makes sense that in 2023, Mitski would attempt to sort of combine the sounds of the indie singer-songwriter Mitski from a decade ago with the modern, current Mitski, and you know what? It's an important thing to do, because at this point in time specifically, and at no other point in time, both past or future, is there one thing that is true. The past Mitski is not far enough away for this to feel like revivalism of an old sound, and the current Mitski sound is not so overdone that it feels overwrought. This is the perfect time for her to attempt to draw influences from both different ends of her career, and ultimately that is what she does here. And hey, all things considered, The Land is Inhospitable and So Are We is the most straightforward and understandable, yet still well executed way to pull off this exact connection between two different eras of one great musician. Most of the compositional complexity that's been found in a lot of Mitski's modern work is overtly presented right here on The Land is Inhospitable. In fact, I would say that some of the more bombastic moments that are found throughout this record are something that it really does proudly wear right on its sleeve. There is no hiding some of the more epic songs here, even if they don't take up the entirety of a song. I mean, sure, the record is structured around Mitski's songwriting, vocals, melancholic presence, but you can't deny that the orchestral arrangements and some of the backing vocals used to really just add a certain sort of powerful punch to some of the vocal passages from Mitski, really do add a grand feel to everything without making them feel cheesy or corny. It just feels so striking in an odd way, and again, it feels very grand, it feels elegant, more so than perhaps anything else that we've seen from Mitski to date. Listening to songs like I Don't Like My Mind, they feel over the top enough that they almost come across as something that could soundtrack the death of a really beloved character in a really striking TV show or movie, but at the same time, they maintain this essence of humanity that keeps them grounded and prevents them from coming across as synthetic in any way or even anything remotely related to that. Ultimately, the tone that this record takes up in that regard allows The Land is Inhospitable to feel appropriate in the current age of Mitski's discography. It feels like a natural bit of artistic progression for her once again, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily feel like a compromise of her current sound for the sake of adding more flourishes to an older sound. A lot of the more grand qualities, a lot of the more stadium-esque qualities even, that have been present on her past couple albums are still here in the delicate form that they've always been. I'm not saying that this is like an AOR album or anything like that, but just some of the more uplifting moments and really ascension-like moments here are still present. They've been present for a couple records now, and I think you get my point. That being said, there still are a lot of moments here that feel much more artistically and creatively relevant to some of Mitski's more indie rock singer-songwriter kind of efforts, namely Bury Me at Makeout Creek. Despite all of the orchestration and keyboards, among other things, obviously, there's a sort of emotional rawness here coming from Mitski that we arguably haven't really seen from her in quite some time, and it's also something that parallels very nicely across from the lack of rawness in terms of the actual instrumentals. The massive climactic moments that you hear in tracks like I Love Me After You and Star are reminiscent of very well-loved classic Mitski songs such as Texas Reznikov, albeit without losing their identity because they still have this smooth, newly found, lush sound that really makes them stand out from the songs that they could obviously be connected to from previous Mitski albums. It just ultimately means that they're songs that feel like, again, a combination of old and new Mitski alongside an entirely new era for her. Songs such as The Frost even sort of dabble in the light, jangly indie rock kind of sound that Mitski used to participate in at a much more constant rate, and I think it's nice to see again. I don't necessarily want to say it's better or worse than what she's done with those particular kinds of sounds in the past, but it is extremely well done here, and again, it contains an entirely new identity, and that's what's important. She remains a very skilled performer just in terms of vocals alone, obviously, but what I personally really care about here is the sheer emotion that she draws out of songs like the melancholic Heaven, as well as the deeply romantic My Love, Mine All Mine. It's just nothing short of impressive, and it really proves that no matter what she's doing musically, Mitski can always just pull amazing vocal performances and even highly underrated vocal performances at the drop of a hat. That being said, all of her different moments here vocally, whether it be some of the most subtle and restrained vocal moments or some of the more powerful performances that she delivers in terms of sheer ability, it always comes across as well executed, well placed, and generally well thought out beforehand, leaving the record structured but, again, emotionally striking. As a whole, however, I would say that the thing that really ties things together here is just Mitski's songwriting, which obviously she has always been a consistently great songwriter over the years. In fact, even on her weakest efforts, there is still lyrical content to praise, but I do think that her lyrical abilities are at their most literally poetic here. By this, I'm not just saying that the lyrics are really well written. I mean, of course they're well written, but I also specifically mean that The Land is Inhospitable and So Are We comes across as being penned by some sort of mythical writer slash literary figure in its best moments. That's genuinely how good I think a lot of the songwriting content on here is. I mean, it's deeply moving, and without a single question in my mind, some of the best songwriting that she has produced across her entire career up to this point is found right here, which also leads me to maybe want to argue that this is her best album to date, but that's a conversation for another time. For example, Buffalo Replaced has this sort of semi-surrealist reflection with a lot of emotional stillness to it, at the same time a lot of lyrical minimalism that manages to be just vague enough to entice but still fleshed out enough to feel complete and not really leave the listener wanting after finishing the track. It's a really impressive exercise. The same track's opening lyrics, Mosquitoes can enjoy me, I can't go inside, I'm sucking up as much of the full moon so bright, also acts as one of the standout moments where Mitski utilizes insects as an allegory for describing more complex emotions, and that is a motif that appears several times throughout the record, both in very obvious places and some more subtle lines here and there. And I think it's a pretty unique thing to do lyrically. Obviously, lyrical motifs are not super rare or anything like that, especially in more semi-conceptual records such as this, but at the same time, I think that the particular way it's presented here and the manner in which it is executed, it's done well, and it feels pretty its own thing. That being said, in these moments of somewhat hopeful tranquility, a lot of it ends up being broken up by some downright depressive lyrics that are kind of brutal to really get through, but at the same time are just as powerful as anything else on this record, and perhaps even more powerful than anything else of a similar tone that Mitski has put out in the past. I mean, really, any of the positive feelings that this album manages to conjure up for any given listener, Mitski usually has a track or two right after those songs that just says, nope, fuck you, you're sad now, and I can respect that. It works really well. I'm Your Man is a devastatingly self aware breakup song with lyrics like, "No one will ever love me like you again, so when you leave me, I should die. I deserve it, don't I?" Which I don't think I really need to explain why that just sucks to hear in the best way possible. There's also The Deal, where a narrator who is presumably Mitski goes to sell her soul, and it seems like it's going to be your normal, oh, I sold my soul kind of story, which I personally think is a bit underdone, until you realize that the narrator doesn't want to do it for any personal gain, but just because they don't want to exist anymore. And it becomes this really existential track about getting rid of your soul and begging for someone to take it away from you so you can kind of die, but not really. It's rough. It is emotionally rough, and it's so well done. I mean, the record goes between hugely personal and almost like a more modernized folklorish kind of record. And ultimately, I think that's the beautiful thing about it. It goes between songs that Mitski is writing deep from the heart and songs that are being narrated by semi characters. And ultimately, I feel like it gives a huge amount of variety to the record. And that isn't to mention the nuance a lot of the harsher moments on this album in terms of emotion. I mean, sure, Mitski's being pretty blunt with a lot of the lyrics here regarding things like self-loathing and regret, but at the same time, everything is presented in such a nice, almost pastel kind of way that I ultimately feel like everything kind of almost feels like a soft gut punch compared to a really hard one. The Land is Inhospitable is an album with a variety of highs and lows emotionally, and each of them act as their own sort of great moments in terms of both how hopeful this album can feel and how absolutely hopeless it can come across. And Mitski's songwriting is personal, it's lonely, it's loving, it's heartbroken, and it's almost violently honest in its own sort of uncomfortably romantic presentation. Hey, I will be totally honest here. The Land is Inhospitable and So Are We is a record I was looking forward to the second it was announced, because Mitski puts out great stuff. That being said, after her last two records being good but not great, I wasn't necessarily walking into this with the highest of hopes either, and I think that's fair, personally. What I expected was another strong release that I would primarily be able to recommend to fans of Mitski, and what I was left with was possibly a contender for her best album to date. Don't quote me on that, but maybe. The Land is Inhospitable and So Are We is emotionally brutal, it's compositionally excellent, it's by far one of the most beautifully written singer-songwriter albums of the year up to this point. So if you're someone who decided after the past couple of Mitski albums that following her output just wasn't for you, now is a great time to tune back in because she is once again on top of her game. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.